first thing I want to say is that there is a very policy wonk, deep theory, anthropology definition of cyborg that is different from the one that you and I are going to use in this conversation. Mm-hmm. So there's this argument that anytime we engage with technology, we're doing an act of a cyborg, which I if that's a theoretical framework that helps people, good for them, but I don't think it's great in terms of outreach, because there definitely is something different between, I use this ring to show where I went to school, but you know what? I can take it off.
Yeah.
Versus a neural link that is
in your head.
Exactly. Absolutely. Ian Hodder, who's a very famous archaeologist, is doing a lot of work right now on how technology has always shaped human evolution. What worries me, if we're talking, I admit the genetics are in my conception less worrying than AI and automation technology. That's what really, gives me the cold sweats.
Yeah.
What worries me is when transhumanism becomes almost post-humanism, when we stop letting humanity or, our religious traditions or our cultural traditions, when we stop letting these guide us, and instead we let the technology guide us, right? What happens when these little neural links are used, to mine our data or to subtly influence us to buy this or vote this way, or even something as simple as, a computer saying, actually, this is the most progressive path for us to take, or this is the best way to achieve more, right? And that's what's sort of spooky to me about that transhuman idea is, right, anthropology is literally the study of mankind. It's the study of humanity. I think we need to keep humanity at the center of that.
Yeah. I mean, some people will argue that we're just, I don't believe in this, but that this is just a necessary step we need to take. Because we could become immortal if we just scan our minds. Because I believe in a soul, but some people, most physicalists, whatever, they think if you scan your mind and you put it in a computer or robot, then you're infinite. You have all your memories and you could live forever. Right. And you're just a super intelligent, I guess you're not even carbon-based anymore.
Silicon. Yeah.
So yeah, you're silicon-based super intelligence. And that just doesn't seem like there's something just fundamentally that seems like what makes us is our biology, our hearts pumping, our minds working together. And it just doesn't seem like we'd be alive if we were in a computer.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And again, this may be my own. So I'm also a devout person. So of course believe in a soul and all that. So the immortality, I think we sort of can get that another way.
Yeah.
And which a lot of humans historically have believed, right, in an eternity and a divinity through the soul, whether that's a reincarnation in the Hindu belief, salvation in, a Christian or Islamic belief, and thousands and millions of other ways to believe that. I also agree with you that there is something phenomenological about the human experience that we cannot be. I find a great danger in this hyper-rationalistic approach to the world, right? And as I say this as someone who employs science, uses science, I'm not like one of these Looney Tunes or like, we can never know anything. Yeah. It's all subjective. Like, I do believe in facts. I do believe in inquiry based on evidence. But when you try to reduce the human brain, which is, this organic, super complex thing, to not even touch on the spiritual element that many people, myself included, really do believe in, to reduce that down to code, to ones and zeros, to numbers, is I agree with you. It's a facsimile of life. In some ways, I see it as almost an immaturity. It's a very fearful thing in the Western world, and I say Western, more westernized, industrialized, whatever you want to call the worldview, where there is only the here and now. You are only the individual, right? Your family doesn't matter, your culture doesn't matter, your religion doesn't matter. It's just you. that is the mindset in my mind that is drawn to these pseudo immortalities, because even if you're not a religious man or woman, for much of the world, your children are your immortality. The fact that your genes, that's very biological, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
Your genes will carry on, or your nephews, or, that is a legacy. Or maybe you create something. Maybe you can create, an organization or a company or an activist group that you're very passionate, and that's your legacy. This idea that we need to salvage some shadow of our conscious mind strikes me as, in some ways, elitist, right? Because surely this won't be available to everyone, will it?
Exactly.
And it strikes me as very, very unadventurous, right? How are these people not curious? Are they right? Is there nothing? Is there something? I mean, yeah, it's never been a philosophy that's, and we go back as far as the organicists of classical Greek thought, of early Christian and Islamic thought, who say that, the body is our vessel for the soul, or even a Descartesian thought, right? Or Cartesian ideas of the early modern period, where the body is a fundamentally aesthetic machine, right? It's this idea that the body allows us to experience senses that our mind interpret as life and emotion, and what he would have called animal magnetism, which is a whole other maybe that one's not true. Yeah. But I completely agree with what you're saying. I don't think you can capture that on a server.
Yeah. So what do you think connects, because I'm Catholic, and I philosophy, and in my classes and in the field, most people are very physicalist, because their argument is, well, we have no evidence of the soul, because you can't locate it. It's a spiritual thing. So how do you think the soul, or whatever the spiritual thing is, connects with our bodies here? Because I know Descartes thought it resided in the pineal gland, which kind of makes sense now. Because now it's funny, like they just found that it releases DMT.
Yes.
And I'm like, DMT takes you to another frequency of whatever. But I thought that was kind of just an interesting thing. They didn't know what it was. It had a bunch of folds, and it wasn't a duplicate. It didn't have another side on the other thing. But do you have any thought of how it connects?
So I myself am Anglican, Anglo-Catholic. Obviously my father's family is very Irish Catholic. In terms of that connectivity, I am often drawn to an epistemological argument rather than maybe a biophysical one, which obviously, you're right about the pineal. You're right about these questions of, well, why do we have these organs if not to experience something revelatory? But in terms of epistemology, to look for the soul with science is almost akin to explaining volcanoes with God.
Yeah.
Right? I really do believe there is... I can't remember for the life of me who said this quote, but it's basically an idea that, science can tell us how, and religion can tell us why. Right?
I think my priest said that to me once. I think it was like St. August. I don't want to say St. Augustine if I don't know it, but I think it was some saint.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. We're measuring it with the wrong thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you think humans even have the tech? I guess it won't even be technology, but the resources to measure this kind of stuff? Like, will we ever have proof? Because I guess it's the mystery of faith is what the Catholics always say. Right. So
I guess for me, it comes down to this question, and I'm sure a lot of this is just it's innate to Christian, Islamic, and latter day sort of theology that says, well, faith is powerful because you don't know it, right? Look at the Gospel of St. Matthew to St. Thomas, blessed are those who do not see but still believe. But you can look at that cross-culturally as well, right? All ancestral groups have had some type of spiritualism, some type of a complexity that could not be simply measured and simply defined by a rational science. So in my opinion, and again, I've never like tried to capture a soul, but in my mind, I don't know if you could do that, right? I don't know if you could convince science of faith, because they are just, in my mind, again, very divergent epistemologies. So if I can raise a comparison, I'm sure you're familiar with the placebo effect in science. When people who believe in indigenous medicine, whether that's Chinese medicine, whether that's traditional European medicine, Hispanic medicine, American Indian, when people who believe in indigenous medicine are given indigenous medical treatments, they sometimes get better. We can see this biologically, that they are physically getting better, even though the science of these treatments says, well, this doesn't work. If we look at Europe, right, maybe being touched by the bone of a saint, or if we look at, North American indigenous practice with certain leaves or certain herbs that science says, well, that doesn't work, it's not enough potency, and they just write off as placebo. It's mind over matter to the body. And that's how they need to describe it in that framework. But if you have a syncretic view with faith, then, maybe that really is God or the spirit of an ancestor, or I don't see that these frameworks have to be opposed, but I also don't think you can force them into one.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like we've lost a lot of our spiritual side as humans, especially when the colonists came and just wiped out all the shamans because they were like the source of power of their tribe. Right. That's like a very big disconnect now, because I really do believe you need the spiritual side along with what we have now for a healthy relationship in life. And I feel like we can kind of see the consequences of not being spiritually present with all the war and all the capitalism's good, but the way we take it all the way of just let's make money, because I do think we need competition to make products better. But when it's to the point where it's just anything to make a quick buck, that's where I'm like, it gets a little dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to read accounts, especially in North America. So, we want to talk about lost religious traditions. Look at the Romans expanding into Gaul, right? Completely wiping out these Druidic faith traditions. And then in North America, it's really fascinating how different, colonizing religious groups treat indigenous faith practice. So the Aztec religion, right, is treated as openly demonic, right? They, as you say, the priests are killed, the holy texts are destroyed. But we look at the Inca, who are, this is very simplifying, but their primary deity was a solar deity. And the Catholic Church said, okay, we can work with that. We've already incorporated a couple solar deities. We can work with that.
Yeah.
And with a lot of North American indigenous beliefs, Algonquin beliefs, as well as Haudenosaunee beliefs, they are able to be worked into a very Christian framework, because there is already this creator God. There's this conception of, well, he's in and among people. It's really interesting to see, if we want to talk about comparative religion, a lot of the American Indian nations, which still exist today, are actually very devoutly Christian in their own framework, because they believed at time of contact, and I'm sure many still believe today, in that the spiritual was very immediately powerful. And when they saw that the Catholic priests, the Jesuits, right, who were very anthropological, right, they would go in and learn the indigenous ways of life, they would live among the indigenous, they would eat their food, they would write in their own language, they would give them scripts. What many of the indigenous saw was that, the shaman's magic, to use that reductive term, was not as powerful as this new Jesuit technique. And many times you would also have the inverse, right? You have a very famous story from Saint Marie among the Indians, which is right here in Syracuse, where, these Jesuits arrived and they're healing people, they're doing medicine, and then, there's this horrible hunt, and they're basically driven out of the camp because it's like, well, clearly this medicine, this magic is not good. So it's this very interesting synergy, which goes back to what you're saying about the recognition of a spiritual as powerful. And that was something that both sides of contact shared. Both Europeans and American Indians and other indigenous groups, they both understood that the spiritual was a very real thing, that was a very real concern, and had very real impacts on day-to-day life. And I completely agree. Yeah, that's a real danger that we've lost that. It's hard to capitalize on a spiritual. You can't sell a soul for $1.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too how these people have been spiritual all over the globe that weren't in contact with each other too.
Absolutely.
Spirituality, music, and language spring up everywhere.
Yes.
Which I find so fascinating. And do they even have a link why this stuff is everywhere it is, or any ideas?
There's a thought with language that it may have been pre-Homo sapien, so we may have all evolved from a speaking group, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because dolphins have language, kind of.
Yeah,
they have squeals.
Yeah, they have complex speech, not necessarily language fully.
Okay.
But yeah, absolutely. So we may have evolved that together. Music, and again, I can't speak to the veracity in either direction. It's too far out of my wheelhouse. But some anthropologists have theorized that music actually predates conversational speech, that we would mimic either other primates in a sort of singing, or even something as simple as mimicking birds, mimicking other animals to communicate before the development of sort of language. And we see this in a lot of ritual today, right? In Christian churches, we sing. In many indigenous beliefs, they have a very powerful vocal rhythmic element, right? Of course, the Rig Vedas are given as poems and songs to be sung in India. And yeah, in terms of spirituality is interesting in my mind, because that's the one that is really seems to appear in a lot of different places that may not have a shared lineage. And even our cousins, right? Neanderthal has a religious tradition that we've been able to uncover. Yes.
What was that?
We know that they would bury the dead respectfully. We know that there is some belief in what's called sympathetic magic. So the idea that if you do something, it has an impact that's related to it. So,
like karma kind of a thing?
No. Okay, here's a good example, right? Say that you are... This is not a Neanderthal example, it's a human example.
Okay.
Ötzi the Iceman, right, from the Alps, very early human. They would tattoo in locations where there was joint pain, because basically the idea was your joints hurt, we need to redraw these connections, we will do that with ink, and therefore the connections will be redrawn. It's a very insulting term, but the idea of a voodoo doll is, I think, the easiest way to explain sympathetic magic. And again, that's a problematic term for some cases, but this idea that, I want to hurt someone, I will hurt this representation of them.
Okay.
Or something like, I want to keep my girlfriend in my mind, so I will keep a lock of her hair. It's this idea that you do something in a small scale and it's ritually magnified on a spiritual level. So the Neanderthal had a principle of that. There may have been elements of fire worship or fire in spirituality, but that's a wide stretch. But it might be where a lot of spiritual concepts originate is in fire.
Yeah,
we know that our social complexity is likely tied to the domestication of fire. And when we think about fire, if we try to put ourselves back in their minds, fire is so complex.
It's life.
It's
life. You need it.
You need it. And just think about how hard it is to conceptualize fire if we really try to think about it. I can give you some of my fire, and I have the same amount of fire.
True.
Fire, I cannot touch it, but it can hurt me. It can spring from nothing, but only in certain circumstances. Only the elders would likely carry this fire. They would have the embers. And I'm sure we've all stared into a campfire.
Yeah.
Right?
It's beautiful. It's like
beautiful.
The only chemical reaction we could see.
Yeah.